significant advantage that coming to a school like the University of Utah, BYU could do the same thing. I'm not saying we're better than everybody else, but the big advantage of coming to a school like this is we give you an education and a virtual guaranteed job when you finish, all for the amount of tuition you pay. That's why we can charge so much tuition, right? But almost everybody here, all but one, maybe two people in the MAC graduating class every year have a job already lined up, ready to go before they graduate. That's the good news. The bad news is, in order to get that done, you got to start making some decisions pretty soon. And you're just barely getting into this about what sort of job you're looking for. So just some thoughts. I put down some notes so I don't try not to skip too much. But what kind of job might you be interested in doing? Well, if you want to go to a firm and practice accounting inside of a firm, that has some nice advantages. Some people will do that on a temporary basis for a few years, just to make sure you get down all the concepts we're teaching, and then you move on. Some people will find that the firm is a great career and they will stay. But in a firm, you're going to have a couple of different choices. You can go with a big firm, or sometimes known as a Big Four firm, but Grant Thornton and a few others, BDO, probably qualify as big firms as well. So realistically, there's more like 8 or 9 really big international firms you can go with. There are medium-sized firms. That would be the WSRPs, and that'll be one that you can interview with here, Tanner and Company, and some of that sort. Or you can go with a small firm. Small firms generally have 10 or fewer partners in them. Big firms have thousands, and medium firms are anywhere in between. Most of you, well, I went with a medium-sized firm that promptly became a big firm. I will tell you, I very honestly enjoyed the medium-sized firm, and I really liked the big firm. And I came within an inch of deciding to make my career in the big firm. I liked it there. It was a good place to work. But it's going to have some disadvantages. There tends to be a lot more pressure, a lot more time demand. I was young, male. My wife was going to have to take care of the kids. All I was interested in is maximizing the amount of money I can make. That's a big firm mentality, and it was a great place for me to be. But that's not what everybody wants. Some of you will start off with smaller firms or medium firms, and some of you will work in a big firm for a little while to get the experience, and then switch to smaller firms. Nothing wrong with that either. If you don't want to work in a firm, no problem with that. That's not the only place. It's not even necessarily the best place to work. Some of you will go straight from this program into industry. You can work in a big Fortune 500 type company, or you can work in a much smaller local kind of company. You will probably make more money in the big Fortune 500 company, but you're only going to see a narrower piece of the total operation of the company because you're in a department, and you may not be able to cross department lines quite so well. If you work in a very small company, you might very well find out that you're the entire accounting department, so you see the whole bigger picture, but smaller companies probably can't afford to pay you as much. And a lot of smaller companies go out of business, and then you're out looking for another job. Fortunately, the skills that you're learning are very marketable, so I wouldn't panic if your company goes out of a business. Virtually everybody that happens to will find another job somewhere else. So those are good places to work as well. You could consider education That is becoming a professor. If you want to make money at a professor, don't be a part-timer like me. I do this for fun and entertainment. But if you wanted to be a full professor in the accounting department at the University of Utah, you probably better plan on at least 10 years of working your way up before you become a full professor. But the good news is we don't have a single full professor on our staff that doesn't make a minimum of $200,000 a year. And there is a huge shortage of full professors to teach accounting, so there is a nice career there for anybody who's interested in education as a career.
Do you have to go on and get a PhD to do that, or?
Yes. You have to have an advanced degree in the same subject you're going to teach. So technically, a Master's of Accounting would qualify you to teach at this university. Do we have any professor who has a Master's of Accounting without a PhD? Scott Pickett. For those of you who go in the MAC program and take a tax class, he is terrific. He's one of the best professors you could ever possibly have. But he can never become a full professor and make $200,000 a year because he hasn't got a PhD. Okay? Mike Blackburn is in this really weird spot of, I do have a doctorate, but it's in law, not in accounting. So I can't ever become a full professor in the accounting department, even though I have a doctorate.
Maybe you need to switch over to the law school.
But I could at the law school, and they did offer me a position a couple of years ago, and I told them, no, I have a lot more fun teaching accountants. Okay? But those things are available. Some of you might want to consider going to work for government. And the government might be the Utah state government, it might be the federal government. I mean, technically, even city governments have an accountant working for them as well. What's the advantage of government? Almost always a lot less pressure. I'm not telling you there's no pressure, but I am telling you almost always it'll be a lot less pressure. The other advantage of government is that once you become a tenured employee, they have a hard time getting rid of you. So it tends to be, you got a lifetime job until you want to quit. If you're a lot older, we had a lady in last year's class who was already 55. She was going to have a hard time getting into a CPA firm because she hasn't got enough years left to work her way up. But government doesn't care, and so that there would be a good job in government if she wanted to do that. And the other advantage of government is they have incredible fringe benefit programs, better than most of the other opportunities. Some of you might want to simply be entrepreneurs, to start and own your own business. That's great. We had one guy in last year's class who'd been in the restaurant business for 20 years, and all he wanted to do was become a restaurant consultant. Tough career, because one of those guys just killed himself last week. But now there's an opening there to become a restaurant consultant, and he could make some nice money doing that. Carissa has a great connection in the art world. Maybe she wants to simply become an artist in her own business. All of that is absolutely possible. One thing to think about is you might not want to start where you want to end up. And what I mean by that is, if you want to end up in the art business, it might still make a lot of sense to get a few years in an accounting firm so that you know this stuff by heart. You don't have to think about it or look it up in the book anymore. It's all planted up here. And then move into your eventual business. Or another thought would be, if you want to be in a high-up accounting position inside of a Fortune 500 company, they make a lot of money. But the best route to get there is to go work for a CPA firm in the audit department and then switch over to the industry firm after that. And a very nice route to go as well. Starting in the bottom floor in a big firm, after you graduate from the University of Utah, compared to going to work for a big CPA firm for 5 years and then switching into the industry job, you're many steps ahead of the guy that started on the ground floor, and he'll never catch up. So, in a big industry, that's not necessarily true in a small industry. Okay, so those are some general thoughts, and some of you may have other ideas, but those are kind of the general categories of jobs that we usually have. Ian?
What do you know about the FBI? Because I know that they're interested in accountants too. What do you have any insight into that at all?
Yeah, the FBI hires a lot of accountants. I didn't ever work for the FBI because my hard and fast rule is I'm not taking a job where somebody might shoot at me. That's out. But
I don't think the accountant's going to be out there getting shot at. Are they?
But they had the top 5 floors in the same building I work in for many years, so I got to know a lot of them. And yeah, I mean, I would call that a government job. You got a little less pressure, a lot of really great benefits, and you know, packing a gun around all day gives you a sense of authority. They do hire a lot of accountants. They also hire some quantity of lawyers. Most of their accountants are going to be investigators, not people that go out on the street and arrest people and you know, put the handcuffs on them quite so much. You're going to be an investigator. You're going to be back in their offices working on a computer, looking for certain characteristics of things happening on the computer.
Are they hiring you as a field agent
analyzing
or
books. Or, yeah, go ahead.
Are they hiring accountants as field agents or as something else?
Generally as specialists. You'll make, your starting salary as a specialist will be higher than a field agent, but your upward potential might not be quite as much. But most, I'm not telling you an accountant couldn't be a field agent, but I'm telling you they have a cushier job available that you might be interested in at a higher starting salary. I had some friends who worked at the FBI. You know, they had to be careful what they told me, but they were in the pornography division of the FBI, and they sat in their offices. There was a group of them, so they would talk to each other and sometimes get in the conference room and work together. But they sat there and trolled the internet looking for people that were engaging in pornography, especially child pornography, and did their best to track them down. They did set up sting operations and that sort of stuff to meet with them and catch them. So they had some field agent experience, but mostly they just trolled the internet looking for candidates.
Do they come here and recruit in the fall?
Yes, yes, they do come here. Gary?
Do you know if they have to go to Quantico or?
Field agents have to go to Quantico for training, yes. The specialists don't necessarily go to Quantico. They will usually go somewhere for some training, and a lot of it's in Quantico, but some of it's in other places. Quantico, Virginia is the FBI's big headquarters. Now, maybe some other thoughts. Keep in mind that there might really be a difference between where you should start. Your starting has to have some characteristics. You probably want to have a good enough salary that you can pay your student loans and keep your spouse happy for a little while. You know, that's one characteristic. And you want it to be something that's going to give you good, solid training and a nice resume builder, but it might eventually be intended to lead to something else. So don't mix up your starting job with your ending job. For many, many accountants, those are two totally different things. Don't ever lose sight of your ending job, but that doesn't mean that's the place that you have to start. Okay? Some other thoughts. If your primary goal is to make money, you will make the most money in a big accounting firm or working in for a Fortune 500 kind of company. Okay? What are your starting salary in a big accounting firm? Will probably be somewhere between $45,000 and $50,000. That will go up quite rapidly, and certainly by the time you've been there 10, 12, 15 years, you're probably going to be in excess of $200,000 a year, and there will definitely be people in big Fortune 500 accounting departments, the top guys, or the partners in accounting firms, big accounting firms, that are making more than $1 million a year. There is good money in that business. There's also a lot of pressure and a lot of time demand. And so you're selling your time for money. You got to recognize that. But there is very good money that is available. In a government position, your salary is going to be a lot, not necessarily lower to start, but your upward trajectory is going to be a lot lower. The government is running itself broke and simply can't pay the huge salaries to compete with industry or the big accounting firms. But the government job will have a lot less pressure, very little possibility of losing your job once you get tenure, and a whole lot less demand on the number of hours and the consequences of a bad decision. One other thought, if, this is for Ian's benefit, by the way, in industry, big Fortune 500 type, or in a large accounting firm, the average auditor will make more money than the average tax partner. There's going to be more pressure in the audit side, and probably more serious time commitment, not necessarily limited to tax season. Tax season, the tax people will outwork the auditor, but the auditor has more pressure year-round for more work, and they will make more money. But if you look at any of the big accounting firms, the top 20 people aren't auditors, they're tax. Then the auditor's average is way higher than the rest of the tax, and then the rest of the tax would be lower. Why do we have a few that are higher? They're the ones that are developing proprietary product, things they can sell to the business world, tax deductions that they can put together and sell that are on the cutting edge of tax research, and they can plain and simply make more money than the auditors can, but there aren't very many of them in any given firm. So if your goal is to make money, if that's what's most important to you, and don't be embarrassed about that, that's a worthy goal. Big business or big firms are the better way to go. And generally, audit is probably going to make more money than tax. If your goal is work-life balance, now I'm going to change that dramatically. If you're willing to trade some money that you could have made in order to have a much more balanced life, I think the rules change dramatically. You will be better off in that case in a smaller CPA firm or in the accounting department of a smaller industry, or in a government job, or in a teaching job, and not so much the big industry or big firms. If you are in the tax department, you should expect that you will be required to work a minimum of 50 hours, in some firms 60 hours, in the months of February, March, and the first half of April, and again in the months of September and the first half of October. But if you're in the tax department, that adds up to 5 full months, right? 2.5 and 1.5, that's 4 full months. The rest of the year in the tax department, you probably will not have a requirement of more than 40 hours, And in some firms, it'll more realistically be 35 hours. If you're going to be in audit, your peak season is spread out more. It depends on which audit you happen to be working on at the time. So you can't know a year in advance when your big time is going to be and when your smaller time is going to be nearly as well. But in audit, when you're on an audit, you're going to be working 60 hours a week the whole time that audit is going on. And as soon as the audit's over, you're going to be dumped in the staff room with nothing to do for a few days until the next audit starts. And then you're going to be working 60 hours again. Year round, the auditors probably put in noticeably more hours than the tax people. Not more than 10% more, but something in the range of 5 to 10% more from the audit department. The auditors will do vastly more travel because the reality is your work is going to be away from your office most of the time, or a big portion of the time. So you're going to be out of town, away from your family, living in a hotel. You generally will live in the hotel from Sunday night to Friday afternoon, and you'll fly home and spend the weekend with your family, and then fly back Sunday, and you keep doing that until the audit's done, and then you may easily have a week or two at home before the next audit gets fully ramped up. But you will be spending noticeably less time with your family and more time out on the road. Work pressure. When you're at the bottom of the rung, I suspect most people would say it's more pressure packed to be in a tax department than an audit department. But when you get to the top of the rung, there isn't any doubt there is a lot more pressure working in an audit department than there is a tax department. You're making bigger decisions, more likely to get you sued in the audit setting than you are in the tax department. If you want to control your own schedule, and I'll give you some ideas about that, being able to control your own schedule is vastly more flexible in tax than it is in audit. The reality is, in audit, it's whatever the audits are scheduled, you got to be there. In tax, you can make a more flexible schedule. I know 3 ladies that have previously been in my classes who have gone to a firm here in Salt Lake, where they've cut a deal that 3 of them will do the job of 2 full-time employees. That means that during the 4 peak months, when 60 hours a week is expected, they're doing 2 jobs, 120 hours a week, but it's divided among the 3 of them. So it's only 40 hours a week, even in peak season. And in off-season, where they're expected to put in somewhere between 30 and 40 hours, that's for 2 people, that'd make it 60 to 80 hours. 3 of them are splitting it, and now they're working 20 to 25 hours a week in the summer when their kids are home from school or when it's time to take family vacations. That's one type of flexibility. My type of flexibility was a little bit stranger. I grew up playing baseball. I never wanted to be an accountant. I wanted to play Major League Baseball. I discovered I was better at accounting than baseball, but I grew up playing baseball. And my intent was I was going to have 3 or 4 sons, and I was going to teach every one of them how to be a great baseball player. I have 5 kids, 4 of them are daughters, and my son is severely handicapped. The net result is I never had a son that I could teach how to play baseball. Didn't matter. I put both of my daughters in t-ball the very first time they could go in, and I was determined to teach them how to play baseball until my oldest daughter finally got brave enough to say, "Dad, I don't like this." And I said, "Well, what is it you want to do?" And she points down to the other end of the park and says, "I want to do what they're doing." There was a soccer game going on. So me and my 2 oldest daughters walked from the t-ball field down to the soccer field at the end of the park, and at roughly age 35, I watched the first soccer game I had ever seen in my life. I had no idea how many people went out on the field, or what they were supposed to do, or what was a good strategy and what was a bad strategy. I just watched a game. My daughter says, "This looks like fun, I want to sign up next year." So we signed her up for soccer. I thought, well, if my daughters are going to play, maybe I ought to learn the rules. So I checked the box on the form saying I was willing to be an assistant coach. Within a week, I'd been called for both of my daughters' teams, not to be the assistant coach, but the head coach, because I was the only guy that checked any box at all.
That's what happens.
For the next 14 years, I coached soccer for my two oldest daughters. We had a soccer event 6 days a week, 11 months out of the year. I took June off only because I needed a rest, but we played winter ball, summer ball, didn't matter. We did 6 days a week, 11 months of a year for 14 consecutive years. That put me in this position of I needed to be on the soccer field at 3:30 every day. As a tax man, I could be on the soccer field at 3:30 every day. When all the kids got out of school, I was there working with them. I didn't have to wait till I got home at 6 o'clock. I was there at 3:30 to work with them. Does that mean that I worked less hours? No. I still had to earn a living. I still had the clients I had to take care of. But what the tax flexibility meant for me is I could take off from 3 o'clock to 7 o'clock when I was most needed by my kids, as long as I went back to work from 7 o'clock till midnight, or 7 o'clock till 11 o'clock. I had flexibility in my schedule, and that made a huge difference in my life. That is not possible in the audit department, but that's the kind of flexibility that can be built into tax practice to the extent that you want to do that sort of thing.
And you were doing that working in a firm, or was that your own?
I began doing that working for another firm.
And they let you do that?
Well, it might not be totally correct to say they let me do it. I did it, and they didn't dare stop me. But they didn't feel inclined to stop me because I was still getting my work done.
Gotcha.
I had the flexibility that I had to get 8 to 10 hours of work done during the day, but it didn't matter which hours I was doing that amount of work. I did that for probably the first 8 years inside of a firm, and then after that left and formed my own firm where I could form my own rules, but yeah. Let's see. There are also part-time jobs available. Difficult to do that in an audit because you're either on the audit or not on the audit. And if you're on the audit, it's a full-time job. You could do less audits per year, but what that would really mean is you're full-time 50 to 60 hours a week while you're on an audit, and then nothing to do while you're off of an audit. So it'd be hot or cold kind of thing. But you could have more time off than the typical auditor does. But in a tax practice, I have a lot of former students who are working on a purely part-time basis. One of my favorites plays the oboe and fully intends to be in the Utah Symphony someday. That's his passion. That's his real job. He works in an accounting firm 20 hours a week year-round and 40 hours a week during tax season, solely to feed his family while he's working his way up the oboe world. That sort of flexibility is a lot more available in a tax practice. And I guess I'm skipping one group, information systems. Almost everything I'm saying about the flexibility of a tax practice would apply to the flexibility of an information system. It's the audit, and that doesn't mean they're bad guys. It's just by the nature of you're at a client's office working for the client is watching you. that tends to be a lot less flexible in the number, in how you structure your work hours. If your eventual goal is to be an entrepreneur, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, that is a very worthwhile life goal. What are you going to do until you get there? Well, you could start being an entrepreneur fresh out of school, but good luck paying your student loans. Entrepreneurs generally don't make a lot of money in the first year or two. So many of you might want to go somewhere to get training to be an entrepreneur. In that case, tax is good training. Taxes are going to be a significant part of what you need to do as an entrepreneur. But audit would be at least equal and maybe even better training to be an entrepreneur, because keeping track of everybody else, knowing how to cost your products, knowing how to write business plans might be even more valuable than knowing the tax rules. So for entrepreneurship, I would tend to say audit probably is a better background than tax. If you want to be self-employed, you want to be an accountant, but you don't want to work for the man. You want to have your own one-person firm, or maybe 2 or 3 of you and your best friends get together and form a 2 or 3 person firm. There are firms with 5 or fewer partners all over this town. In fact, I think I can honestly tell you that if I add up the number of accountants who work in firms with 5 or fewer partners in this town, it's more than the ones that work in 5 or more partners in the firm. I mean, that's the norm of the practice. But almost 100% of those smaller firms have a tax practice, not an audit practice. Why? Because audit simply requires a whole lot more people than that. You can't get an audit done on a decent schedule without having a much larger team than that to work on it. So if your goal is to be in a small firm where you're friends with everybody, that probably favors tax. What if your goal is to be in other professions? Most years I have somebody who's thinking about going to law school. Occasionally I have somebody is here learning how to count their dollars because they tend to go to medical school. If you want to go into any other kind of profession, great. There is if you're going to law school, many lawyers become tax lawyers. So there's a very natural track for tax accountants to become tax lawyers. But don't let that fool you. There is probably a better track being an auditor and then moving into law school, because knowing how to read and analyze financial statements, or more specifically, how to break them down and find where the skeletons are hidden, is what litigation is all about. So there's a very good route for auditors to move into law. I'm not so sure auditors move into medicine very often, but to law, good route there too. And that's probably all I've thought of saying, but questions? Ian.
I have a friend that's an audit partner in one of the firms downtown. It's a small firm, but one thing he said, and I don't know if, I just kind of want to get your take on this. So obviously, whether you're doing tax or audit, you're going to meet a lot of clients. You're going to meet a lot of people who have businesses around. And he says that he meets a lot of upstart businesses and people that actually offer him equity stakes in their business to basically sort of be their consultant to him, right? So he sort of does that on the outside. I mean, is that something, do you see that a lot, where you have guys working in the industry, but they've got a lot side things going on where they spend time with clients as equity partners?
Yeah, I see that in a couple of different ways. People that have a full-time job but want to do some form of accounting in the evening on the weekends just to kind of keep their hands in it. It's almost impossible for that night and weekend work to be audit, because it's just going to plain and simply be a conflict with your day job to be an auditor. Almost all of those people are doing tax work. On the other hand, do I see people who have a good audit background, who went to a big firm and got the audit background, who are then sometimes going out and working for a quitting their full-time audit job? It's real hard to do another job while you're in an audit job. The conflicts are just terrible. I mean, to give you an idea, we have a firm in town known as Tanner and Company that at one point about 6 years ago fired their entire tax department and became just an audit firm. They started another tax department since, by the way. But they did that because they were just running into a conflict with their tax department every time they turned around. And conflicts are a lot more serious on the audit side than they are on the tax side. But I've known some audit people who go to work leave their audit job. You probably have to leave the audit job to get there. One exception that maybe your friend is doing. And join maybe 2 or 3 firms as their in-house controller and taking an equity position. Yeah, I have a partner in my law firm that's done that several different times and taken an equity position. I can honestly tell you that if you're an average person, way more than half the time that equity position is going to end up being nothing. There's no value to it. The company goes out of business, but all you got to do is hit one and you're rich for life. So you do 20 of them knowing that you only have to hit on one. And yeah, that's available. It's hard to do that while you're in a big audit structure, but you could quit and do that. The one exception is Chinese audits. There are a number of people in this town who audit Chinese companies. Chinese audits tend to be very, it's a 3-day audit kind of thing. You don't have to move there for a month to do their audit, and you don't run into nearly as many conflicts because they're doing business only in China. The ones that do business in the US are in the big audit department, not in the Chinese audit department. So yeah, I've got some friends doing that, and they can do the Chinese audits and the equity position. The only comment I would make about Chinese audits is I did spend 8 years on the State Board of Accountancy, taking people's licenses away from them for getting themselves in trouble. And what was one of the top 3 things you could do to make sure you lose your license? Chinese audits. Be really careful. Okay. Other thoughts? It's unfortunate that we push this on you so fast, but the reality is when you start your fall semester, you've got to have a pretty good idea of whether you're going to be tax, audit, or AIS. I'm not telling you can't switch, but I am telling you it's really hard to switch during your education, and it might require that you stay an extra semester to get it done. So you want to do your best to make as intelligent a decision as possible by the start of the semester, which is in August, and we're already in June. Do people go out in the real world in the audit department and sometimes switch to the tax department? Absolutely. Do people go out in the real world as scheduled in a tax department and later switch to audit? Absolutely. There is movement. And do they move into information systems? Probably even more than they move between tax and audit. Yeah, there is movement once you get inside of a firm or inside of an industrial company. That is definitely available. But you still had to pick which one you were going to specialize in the MAC program before you got there. Other questions? All right. Good luck. I'm available to answer questions individually at any time you want. I can honestly tell you that my time at KPMG was very enjoyable, and I almost decided to stay at KPMG for my entire career. What made me not do that? Well, the plan was always to go to law school, and I decided I better stick with the plan. And I'm glad I did. The working for smaller companies in a smaller setting has given me a lot more flexibility than I ever would have had at KPMG. But I'm not gonna tell you it was a bad place to work. It was a great place to work.
Did you do an internship before you went there?
Did I do what?
Did you do an internship? I'm just trying to figure, how did you decide tax? Did you do an internship?
Great question. How did I decide tax? I'm gonna be brutally honest with you, and you might not like it. I took an audit class at the University of Utah from a professor that I'm not gonna mention his name for reasons that'll become obvious. He was terrible. He spent more time yelling at us for reading the Chronicle because we were bored of sitting up there and listening to him. I'm not sure he ever read the book. I finished his class with an A and knew I had no idea what I was supposed to do when I showed up for an audit. I knew nothing. I took a tax class from a professor named Ken Haney, who I would without question rank as the best professor I ever had at this university in any department or school at this university, and I loved it. I mean, I was eating up, I took every class he taught. I was just eating up everything that I was hearing from him, and it was already decided I was a tax man long before I graduated, because it was, to me, just so much more interesting and fun. I'm not trying to talk you into switching. In your case, it might very well be you're having a whole lot more fun taking the audit classes. That's great. What I'm saying is find your passion out of the classes and which one you're having more fun at and more interesting. And that's how I decided.
Right. I'm just wondering if sitting through a class can really, because sitting here and learning about the stuff, I mean, I understand that you might enjoy one thing more than the other, but once you get out there into the real world, I've found from past experience that the idea of something seems really good, and then once you get there, it's not that great. So, you know what I mean? So like, I'm just trying to figure out if, and I'm sure a lot of us are probably in the same boat. That's why we're here today.
You are trying some other field.
Yeah, that's why we're doing what we're doing. And so I don't want to make that mistake again. So I guess my question is, do you feel like, is it a good idea to do an internship first and see?
It's a wonderful idea to do an internship if one comes up. That was not a common event when I was at this institution, so I did not do an internship.
We just really can't
It's
do
not
that.
because nobody wanted me, it was just something we didn't do very often. So I can remember going up to the placement center. We didn't have our own in-house when we did it all through the University Placement Center. And the lady looks at my grades and says, "Oh, you're gonna have an easy time getting a job." And I say, "But wait a minute, I'm asking for a job as an accountant, and I haven't worked for even 1 hour as an accountant any time in my entire life. Who's gonna hire me for that?" It wasn't that hard. If you've got decent grades and, more important, a desire to put the time in and move ahead, they want you. I don't want to mention her name because I don't want to embarrass anybody, but I have a student that was in this intensive program about 3 years ago who went to work for a firm that I have some good connections with, and so I know I'm following her career. And she went into tax, and boy, she was excited about tax. She's now in audit. She found out that tax just wasn't as exciting as she thought, so she switched to audit, and that sort of movement is possible. But she's a auditor whose entire education is in tax. She might get ahead faster if she'd have done her education in audit, but there is some movement once you get there.
Okay.
Tim?
How hard is it to get into one of these big four, or like these bigger firms versus the medium-sized or smaller firms? You know?
We will place dozens of students in the big firms out of our MAC program every year. Dozens. I'm talking 30, 40, 50, 60 people. But we also have I think, well over 200 graduates. So it's not all of our graduates by any means at all. In some cases, the ones that didn't go to a Big Four didn't go there because they didn't want to. They made another decision. But it's probably fair to say there were some people whose first choice was a Big Four and they didn't get in. It's more competitive to go to a Big Four than somewhere else or one of the really big firms. I will also comment, however, it looks better on your resume and gives you at least as good a training. So if you have an opportunity to go to a big firm, even if you don't want to end up in a big firm, think about it, because that's a nice thing to have on your resume for the rest of your life. But yeah, I think some of our students wanted to go there and didn't get there, but a lot of our students do go there.
Do you know?
It's going to be based on grade point probably more than anything else, and your advantage is it's going to start clean. They don't care about your undergraduate grade point. That was in a totally different field. It's your grade point for the next 3 semesters. It's probably quite important to work to keep that grade point well above 3.5. I'm not telling you it has to be 4.0, because not very many of our people are going to hit that, but it's probably quite important to be above 3.5.
Okay.
Of
Sam?
the MAC intensives, do you know, have there been many that make it to a Big Four, having missed the summer internship that these guys are offering?
Yes. Our experience, we didn't know this when we started the MAC intensive program. I was part of the committee that sat down and thought about, is this something we really should do? And we sort of assumed that if we were bringing people from all these other majors, they were going to struggle in the MAC program. Not true. The average graduate out of the MAC program will perform in the top half of the MAC program, not the bottom half. There's going to be a couple of you that'll probably be in the bottom half, but that's, the ones that aren't working quite as hard. The majority of you are going to be in the top half of the MAC program, and the single best student in the entire MAC program last year, Tristan. You see her in here most of the time, and she was an intensive student, and she was the top #1 student. You've got an edge up on those undergraduates if you will put in the time and go for it. This is a really good place to start. I don't know, did I answer your question or did sidetrack?
Kind of. As far as how many MAC intensives make it to a Big Four. Because even Tristan's still, she's at Grant Thornton, which is big, but.
I would, in my mind, I would count Grant Thornton as a Big Four firm.
Okay.
And yes, she's there, and she had that job lined up by probably the 1st of August
Right.
of her first year. And Grant Thornton is in the Big Ten is probably how I'd better define it.
Yeah. Is she the first one from the MAC?
Oh no,
Okay.
not even close. Honestly, I'd probably have to say that a smaller percentage of the intensive program ends up in the Big Ten firms compared to the MAC group in general. And the #1 contributing factor to that is the lack of the internship. They like to line up all of their employees through an internship, and if they don't get to see it in an internship, it's a little more competitive to get in. So I think I would agree that's the #1 factor. The #2 factor is you guys come from a far more diverse background, and a larger portion of the people in the intensive program don't want to work in a Big 8 or Big 10. They want to go somewhere else, and that contributes a lot to the percentages as well.
That makes sense. One other question. On the tax side of the house, starting out in a firm, what are you doing? Is it personal taxes, corporate taxes?
Great point. Something I didn't stress very well. If you are an auditor, you're preparing audits. Who needs audits? A bunch of Chinese companies, but be careful about them.
Companies that
all
have
of,
investors.
pardon?
Companies that have investors.
Companies that have investors, or better known as the Fortune 500 or Fortune 2000 companies, the ones that the big international companies whose stock trades on one of the major stock exchanges and have investors. That's category 1. And category 2 is companies that have large loans from banks, and the bank requires the audit in order to keep the loan outstanding. What's the common characteristic between those two categories? It's bigger, not necessarily biggest, but bigger business. If you are in audit, you will spend most of your life working for big business. The advantage is you're going to make more money, you're going to meet a lot of important people. There's nothing wrong with either of those two advantages. Part of that isn't for me. Why is that not for me? I want to work for the common man, for the small business, for the individual. That's what gives me my kicks. And if that's where you want to be, that's a tax practice. The auditors are never going to meet most of those. So the reality is, yes, if you go to work in either a big CPA firm or a medium or small firm, the vast majority of the clients that you're going to work on, not your first year, your whole life, are going to be individuals and small businesses. If you go in the audit department, they're mostly going to be medium or huge businesses. So yeah, what's the first year like being an auditor or being in the tax department? Well, I have some idea because my daughter is right in the middle of her first year of being in a tax department. She walked in the first day and they said, you got to go to staff training. So they did send her out of town for 2 weeks. I picked up the kids at daycare for 2 weeks while she was gone. And so yes, there was some travel in being in the tax department. She came back from staff training after 2 weeks and sat down in her desk, and somebody came along and plonked a bunch of returns on there, almost all individuals. Some of them were even payroll or sales tax returns compared to income tax returns. The majority of them were income tax returns, and said, do the return. She says, what are you talking about? You know, I'm brand new, I don't know anything about business. And they said, you don't understand. The program is you do the return the best you can. Don't worry if you make a mistake, because that return isn't going out of this office until somebody else has redone everything on there. But we can't teach you how to do a return unless you do it. So here, do it. And as a brand new person in her 3rd week at the office, she was tackling complex issues and doing a return with the backup assurance of knowing that if she blew it, somebody else was going to find it before it went out. That's a great way to learn. And she learned a lot. She's probably still going to be doing that by the end of her first year and maybe somewhat into her 2nd year. What I found in my firm was by the time I got barely into my 2nd year, I wasn't the guy doing the return anymore. I was the guy doing it over again to find all the errors. And you know, that comes pretty fast, at least by your 2nd or 3rd year. You're that next level up that is the one that's expected to do it right.
Where is she working?
BDO. But in saying that, I don't want to give you any prejudice. The BDO isn't necessarily better than anywhere else. That just happened to be where she picked. Could her dad have found her a job in a million firms around town? Of course. But her response to me is, Dad, get butt out. I want to do this myself. I'm good and I can do it myself. Get out of the way. And she did, and she got a good job at BDO. Okay. Other questions or thoughts? All right. That's probably enough to lay on you for one day. If you after a little while decide you want to do this again, I can, or if you just want to do it individually. I have expressed some prejudices, I fully recognize that. I'm not trying to say that one specialty is better than another. I'm simply trying to give you the characteristics so that you can fit them into the kind of life you want to live, and then you decide which one is the better one for you. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.